Scientist does not come along and say, oh, it's all caused by us, it's all our fault, the science is settled, can I have another grant, please? That's not what he says. He says, well, maybe it's us. And he publishes the reasons why he thinks that in due mathematical language, not the kind of hand-waving stuff about tipping points and all that rubbish that you hear from the environmental movement, but a proper mathematical formulation of his hypothesis. And he publishes it after peer review in a learned journal. And then comes what Popper calls the error elimination phase, EE. And this is where all the other scientists, and even occasional troublemakers like me, pile in and say, nah, you can't get away with that, you've used the wrong data, or you've left a bit out, or your theory is contrary to established theory, or some error or another, and therefore the theory is not true. And if the theory at that point is disproven, that's the end of it. It cannot live to fight another day. Or, in a very rare case, it might be proven. But that, too, is almost unheard of in the physical sciences, and particularly in climatology. Even in nuclear physics, it's quite slippery.
Well, science is not about proof.
No, it isn't. I'm going to come to that. Let me finish the algorithm, and then they'll see why it isn't about proof. The most normal outcome from this algorithm is you get to the error elimination phase, and nobody is either able to prove or disprove the hypothesis, in which case it lives to fight another day, and in doing so, somewhat modifies the original general problem we started with up at the top there, and you get a new general problem, GP2, which is a slight variant and a slight improvement, a slight tightening of the original general problem. And so, by this slow process of going round and round again, with new hypotheses coming in to illuminate the general problem and so to refine it, science moves crabwise towards the truth. And in much of science, therefore, absolute proof is not attained at all. But gradually, as hypotheses are put forward that survive perhaps hundreds of years of testing, they acquire an almost iconic statement as if they were absolutely true, even though we can't ever be entirely satisfied that they are. So what science most of the time is about, unlike mathematics where some of the time, as with Pythagoras' theorem, you can find absolute proof, in most of the sciences, most of the time, what you're trying to do is not to prove something, but to constrain the uncertainties that surround it. And to illustrate what that rather complicated phrase means, to constrain uncertainties, we don't know, as I started by pointing out with the Royal Society's quotations, we don't know how much global warming will occur in response to a doubling of CO2 concentration. The IPCC's hypothesis, which it and others are now advancing as though it had been absolutely proven, is that it'll be around 3.26, plus or minus 0.69 Kelvin or Celsius, to one standard deviation and 2 decimal places. But that is not proven because in the 1995 report they said it would be 3.8, and in the 2001 report they said it would be 3.5. Now they say it's 3.26. And if they're honest, they're going to have to bring it down again in the next report as they feel their way towards the truth, as more data becomes available, and so they can constrain the uncertainties, which at the moment are fairly wide, and then narrow down on something more like the right answer. So that's a very good question, sir, and I hope I've given a more or less reasonable answer on how science is actually done.
Yes.
And have I got that right?
Yes.
He says yes, thank goodness for that. Having a nuclear physicist sitting staring at you with gimlet eyes is actually quite terrifying.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed watching you on YouTube and listening on podcasts like Alex Jones over the last few years. And I was wondering if you can correct some things I'm thinking about so that I can have them as some take-home messages for my friends. I've garnished these ideas from you, but I might have them a bit wrong.
Okay.
In one video, I watched you talking to a person protesting with Greenpeace, and she kindly allowed herself to be humiliated by you for a good 10 minutes.
I hope I was very polite.
Well, it's quite funny anyway. You talked about how we've actually been cooling for the last 9 years in that video, and I'm not sure at which point or how many years ago that video was made. If that's true, has that just started to recently change? Are we still cooling? That's one thing I'd like to know. I've heard another thing is that that if we are warming, I've heard that as a result of sunspots and solar flares, that all the planets in the solar system are warming. So if that's true, are we warming or cooling because of that question? And
I think I'm
going to leave it at that.
For the moment. Yes. Well, first of all, that video was filmed in November 2009 in Berlin on a very, very cold day. And I was no more warmly dressed than I am today, and was given very short notice that I was going to go out and interview some demonstrators outside a scientific conference at which I have been delivering a paper on the determination of climate sensitivity. And so I went up to the lady that you saw, very pretty blonde. I thought, she's the prettiest, so I should at least have somebody easy on the eye to interview. And my lovely wife didn't mind too much. And so I then asked her various questions, which I think it's fair to say she was a Greenpeace activist, and therefore she knew absolutely nothing, poor sweet little thing. And they now use that video in American law schools to teach the techniques of cross-examination. So don't find yourself on the wrong end of the microphone with me on this end of it. But now to answer your questions, first of all, the one about is the world cooling? Well, as I showed you, the graph of the last 10 years shows, in fact, no significant change either way. Had we stopped off a year or two previously, it would have shown a decline, which has now caught up again and brought the trend level. As to whether we are going to continue cooling because of the diminution in the sunspots on the sun, I was first contacted by this by a guy inside NASA, a technician actually. He said, look, basically I'm on your side, I shouldn't really be speaking to you, they all hate you here, he said. But you need to know that the magnetic convection currents underneath the surface of both hemispheres of the sun are slowing down to walking pace. We've never seen this before. They're quite panicked about it, he said, because they're really worried their grants are going to stop because they think it's going to cause cooling, and that's going to make a mess of all those arguments about global warming. So just thought you'd like to know, he said. Anyway, the next thing that happened was that, this was 3 or 4 years ago, the then solar cycle, which came to an end at every 11 years, it goes up and down. It reached its low point, and it stayed there for 3 years. So that the normal 10.6 years of the solar cycle became nearly 13 years. And that usually means that you get a relatively normal solar cycle immediately following the one that was lengthened, which is the one we're getting now, though this too is looking pretty sick. It's not going as far as the previous ones did. But then the cycle after that one, starting in kind of 6 or 7 years' time, that one could prove to be virtually a non-starter with very few sunspots. Not perhaps quite as bad as the Monckton minimum, which after all was the period of least solar activity in the 11,400 years since the end of the last ice age. But it could be perhaps as bad as, say, the Dalton minimum or one of the other smaller minima that we've had since, the Oort minimum, for instance. These are possibilities. But we have to admit, I think, that much of this is speculation, because we just don't have a long enough, reliable indicator of all of the solar phenomena. Actually, we have sunspot records, thanks to the Chinese, going back between 5,000 and 10,000 years, like the Egyptian Nilometer record of the levels of the Nile. It is one of the longest records that we have, but it's not very exact in the earlier years. And also, you need to have all the other solar indicators, such as the planetary indexes, which we don't have for more than probably 30 years since the satellites went up and could remove distortions caused by the atmosphere. So all of this is a rather complicated way of saying, I don't know.
Questions?
Lord Monckton, besides the scientists that are getting all these grants at the moment and benefiting from this ruse, if the kind of governance comes together that you're talking about, who stands to benefit from that? In whose best interests is that outcome?
Okay. Right. Cui bono, as Cicero might have put it. To whom goes the advantage? Well, it's extraordinary how many people can make themselves benefit from this. First of all, the classe politique, the politicians and the bureaucrats. The politicians, because I can tell you, as a politician, there's nothing that we like more than saving you from yourselves at your expense. That's thing number one. We can get away with taxing you until the pips squeak. And because of global warming, we can say that it's good for you and good for the planet. And we can feel as though we're doing something on a moral crusade. And that your paying of taxation is necessary for the planet. We don't, of course, admit that we also get a great deal richer, our pensions get fatter, we get more assistance, and we just have a much more comfortable life, thanks to the extra taxes you're paying. The bureaucrats feel the same, because they have a concept, they used to call it in the British Civil Service, extending the tax base. This meant finding new forms of taxation which reached ever further into people's pockets with the minimum of political cost. And one of the things that bureaucrats and politicians more or less around the world are agreed upon, or have been agreed upon, it's beginning to change, and watch Australia in particular for this. They're beginning to find that what they thought was the minimal political cost of increasing taxation and regulation because of global warming, now they're finding that people aren't buying this, and they're thinking, and indeed rightly on some of the evidence I've shown you, that the central process for deciding the science is quite spectacularly corrupt as well as ignorant, and that therefore they have smelt the bullshit. They can tell this is a scam, and they're not playing anymore. And that's why the governing class, including the media, who will always, of course, sell more newspapers by saying world to end shock, sensation, picture, than the truth, which is a very dull headline, climate continuing changeable. So the media benefit from this too. So do the absolute bankers, the people who would profit most if they could get a worldwide ETS in place. Because what are we trading if we trade carbon dioxide? We are, as the boys in red braces on the London Exchange call it, trading hot air. And therefore we're not trading anything real. We're trading the very air we breathe out. There was once 30% CO2 in the atmosphere. Does anybody know how much there is now? 0.04%. That's all. So all we're doing is putting back in the atmosphere what was there anyway. But no, the traders and the bankers, they're making fortunes out of this in Europe. They're hoping to do so here. They're doing so in America until the Chicago Climate Exchange collapsed when the price of a ton of carbon fell to 5 US cents. Everybody has no point in carrying on with that, so it collapsed. And Al Gore lost millions on it, so hey, some people benefit. But you see all these people, teachers in schools, no longer is religion properly taught or universally taught, so the kids need to be motivated. And what a wonderful new religion is this environmentalism. We have to save the planet. You can hear them saying, and they're all talking baby voices too. There's a consensus. Well, no, there isn't. And even if there were, that's not how science is done, as we've seen. You know, there's nothing in Popper's algorithm to say that it should be done by consensus. If you try and explain that to a school teacher, they're making a lot of money teaching their kids all about this environmental rubbish, making them watch Al Gore's sci-fi comedy horror movie over and over again. So the teachers are gaining by it. And of course, the environmentalists are making a fortune. Many environmental groups, and let's get this clear, they are effectively, you can call them communists, you can call them environmentalists, you can call them fascists, you can call them dirigistes, étatistes, bureaucratistes, centralistes. The French have a lot of words for them. But all of these people are effectively political organisations receiving taxpayers' money to subsidise their political point of view at the expense of all other political parties. So they're making a lot of money out of it and getting a lot of status and a lot of seats in elections out of it. And then also, there are the academics who will do anything as long as it's politically correct. And if you go into a faculty common room and you say, there's no such thing as serious global warming, it's as though you've farted in front of the Queen. You get looked at as though you really have crawled out from under some stone. And then there are the scientists themselves. You can be studying the lesser spotted deputy mayor, for instance, actually not really spotted, but anyway, the lesser deputy mayor, and you can say, please can I have a grant to study the deputy mayor, and they don't react. But if you say, I want to have a grant to study the lesser spotted deputy mayor, in the context of climate change, oh, my dear fellow, how many millions would you like? So you can see there's a lot of vested interests who have come together on this. It's not a giant conspiracy, as some people say, no. It is, of course, some of the scientists, as we see from the ClimateGate emails, have been conspiring together to try and peddle this scare with rather less success than they might have hoped. But what has happened is instead an accidental, but still very powerful, coalescence or coincidence or coagulation of vested interests. And what is a vested interest but a conspiracy against the general interest? And one of the things I try to do in going around the world talking about this is to say that we, the people, know best what is best for us, the people. And we must not, therefore, any longer allow these vested interests, however numerous, however powerful, to prevail.